This video is brought to you by Brilliant. Earlier this month, Brussels issued a list of demands it wanted the UK to fulfil to prove its commitment to improving UK-EU relations. It came just a couple of weeks after the UK's new Labour government announced its intention to form a security pact with the EU, aimed at deepening ties on energy, security and defence, plus several changes to the current Brexit trade deal. However, the European Commission's response to the proposal was remarkably lukewarm, and according to a paper seen by the Financial Times, the bloc first wants the UK to prove its good faith by addressing several Brexit-related issues. So in this video, we'll take a look at the UK's proposed security pact, why Brussels is reportedly lukewarm about UK-EU relations, and what the EU's conditions for increased cooperation actually are. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. But first, let's start by looking at what Starmer's UK-EU Security Pact aims to achieve. Now, we've already made an explainer about Labour's plans for UK-EU relations a few weeks ago, which you should check out for more detail, but we'll give you a quick summary of the main points here too. Essentially, the pact is a large part of Labour's attempt to build a closer relationship with the EU, in contrast to the Euroscepticism of previous Conservative governments, especially under Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who oversaw the UK's ultimate exit from the EU. This is fundamentally because Starmer sees no political gain in picking fights with the EU. Both Labour's base and its parliamentary party are broadly pro-EU, and in their 2024 manifesto, the party set up its position by referring to the bloc as our European friends, neighbours and allies. Starmer and his Foreign Secretary David Lammy have also sought to improve relations with key European allies, notably France and Germany, with an article in Politico last week quoting one French minister as describing Starmer as well-rounded, more convivial and humorous, in contrast to the Conservatives, who were, quote, tetchy and very closed-minded. Anyway, the more technical purpose of the UK's EU Security Pact is to fill a genuine gap in relations. This is because the current Brexit deal, known as the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, or TCA, has few provisions for cooperation on foreign policy, security and defence. The EU's proposed European Defence Industrial Programme makes it difficult for third country businesses to participate, creating a risk that, over time, the UK will be cut out of efforts to deepen defence industrial cooperation with the EU. This also likely disadvantages the EU, given the size of the UK's defence sector and existing links between British firms and those in France, Italy and Sweden. Moreover, on top of defence, the UK also wants to use the pact to facilitate cross-border trade, which became far more complicated for parties on both sides of the Channel after Brexit. The UK's proposed changes to the TCA includes, for example, closer regulatory alignment in the chemicals industry to reduce UK-EU trade frictions and the cost of registering in the UK. Labour also want what they call a veterinary agreement to prevent unnecessary border checks. For context, since Brexit, the EU has treated agri-food exports from Great Britain, like raw meat and dairy products, as if it were coming from a third country, meaning that relevant products now need both physical checks and what's known as an export health certificate, which in turn requires a signature from a vet. While this is standard practice in international trade between third countries, because the UK and EU used to do a lot of trade in agri-food before Brexit, these new checks have proved quite disruptive. Additionally, the UK is seeking agreement on mutual recognition of professional qualifications, or MRPQ. This means that people who are qualified in certain professions in one territory are also recognised in another. Labour were originally optimistic that the EU would just agree to these three proposals, given they're all pretty good ideas, but that's not quite how things have panned out. Both to make sure that the UK is serious about repairing relations and to extract their own concessions, the EU has drawn up a list of about 8 demands to be met before negotiations begin. In broad terms, these are 1. To fully implement existing Brexit agreements on Northern Ireland. 2. To guarantee the rights of EU citizens living in the UK by fully implementing a UK High Court ruling which said that EU citizens living in Britain should not have to make a separate application to win settled status after 5 years of residence in the UK. 3. To respond fully within 2 months to a formal notice from May 2020 alleging breaches of EU free movement rules during the Brexit transition period. 4. For UK authorities to accurately certify animal and plant products at the border. 5. For vets to reject non-compliant consignments at the border and for a scheme to check pets to be urgently deployed. 6. To implement a new regime to provide data on the content of parcels without delay. 7. A mobility deal to allow young people to work and study in the UK and for the UK to rejoin the Erasmus Student Exchange Scheme. And 8. Continued access to the UK's fishing waters after 2026. Most of these should be relatively uncontroversial, but the last two might make Starmer anxious. Starmer actually seemed to rule out a mobility deal when the Commission announced its intention to open negotiations, saying Labour had no plans for such a deal. So going back on this would provide ammunition to arch-Brexiteers like Farage, who have long accused Starmer of planning to secretly reverse Brexit, and would probably conflate a youth mobility deal with freedom of movement, which is genuinely unpopular with many UK voters. Similarly, fishing has always been a politically contentious issue for both the EU and the UK. The current fisheries deal, which allows EU boats conditional access to UK waters, ends in June 2026, but the EU has made it clear that it wants this extended. Unlike the first few demands, which are mainly about the UK sticking to its pre-existing obligations, actually extending the fisheries deal would be a genuine concession from Starmer and cost him real political capital. Still, the UK so far has seemed optimistic, and there have been tentative indications from the EU that closer cooperation is on the cards. For example, last month, the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, said it would be, quote, good if in the months to come there would be a bilateral summit. And it's also been reported that more detailed talks on trade liberalisation are expected in the autumn. Nonetheless, this list of demands is proof that, even if Labour's notion of a security pact is a good faith effort to improve post-Brexit relations, rather than a request for special treatment, UK-EU relations still have a transactional element. There's a lot of difficult decisions to make here, and making huge decisions is difficult, even for world leaders. The good thing is that Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data, programming, and AI. Their interactive classes help build your critical thinking skills through problem solving, not memorizing. So while you're building real knowledge on specific topics, you'll also be becoming a better thinker. For instance, their Predicting with Probability course can help you better understand and assess the world around you. You can learn to wrangle massive datasets, compare distributions, and master fundamental concepts like Bayes' theorem. That might sound a little technical, but with their active learning, you learn this by answering questions like which airline is least likely to have a delay due to weather, and how much more unruly airline passengers have gotten since the pandemic. Data skills are absolutely necessary for navigating the modern world, and Brilliant is the best way to get them. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/TLDR, or click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.